Kia ora, e te whānau. My name is Chikita Kodikal and I am the founder of Allied Justice Aotearoa. Welcome to our 7th episode in the Women in Leadership series. In this episode, I will be in conversation with Malak Shalabi. Malak is a Juris doctor student and FLAS fellow at the University of Washington School of Law. She has written on issues related to torture, occupation, and US imperialism in the Middle East. Malak currently works at American Muslims for Palestine, an education and advocacy organization that promotes the cause for justice in Palestine. Malak is a force to be reckoned with. Her passion and dedication to human rights work in the Middle East must be lauded. Please bear in mind, Malak and I will be discussing her research in this podcast. The material discussed may be disturbing or traumatizing and therefore is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. So, without further ado, I introduce you all to Malak Shalabi. Your profile on the University of Washington website read, "When Malak Shalabi visits her extended family in Jordan, they sometimes drive through the countryside and see Syria in the distance. But there is no going back," she says. "Whenever I spend time with my family and they share stories of life back home, I hold on to every word because this is one of the closest connections I'll ever have to our motherland." What does it mean for you to be connected to your motherland?
So, as a person whose mother is from Syria and my father originates from Palestine, we've had to do a lot within our family and within our community to hold on to our traditions, being so separated from quote unquote back home. And something that my family has really taken seriously and made a priority for us growing up is encouraging us to speak, write, and read Arabic as often as possible, learn and eat Syrian and Palestinian foods to maintain that culture, and then also just practice the Syrian and Palestinian traditions of generosity, honesty, morality. And those are things that I carry with me every day. They're things that my community at large try to incorporate in the way that we treat each other. And in that way, my family and my community has managed to recreate a motherland away from the motherland, and that takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of strength and perseverance, but we uphold our traditions. And of course, being here, we're not isolated from American society, and we're very much influenced by it as well, but you take the best from both cultures and you create your own identity, and you work for what's best, for your people back home and here as well.
What was your journey like to USA?
So I was born in Houston, Texas, in the United States, but my mother is originally from Syria, and then they migrated to Kuwait. And when she came to visit her brother here in the US in Kuwait in the 90s, she was staying for a summer. The Gulf War broke out in Kuwait. So she was essentially stuck. They couldn't go back, they lost their home. So she stayed here with my grandma, and they built a life for themselves from nothing, from scratch. And my family's key out of poverty was education, and they prioritized education and using it as a tool to help people around them and also just make sure they don't fall into that situation again. So my mom made grades her priority. She got into 2 of the top dental schools at the time, and she was able to support us and put us through school as well. So their journey, their immigration journey, hugely has shaped our priorities in life, and it's a story of resilience and strength and perseverance.
It definitely is. How have you, as a Muslim woman of color living in the USA, had to navigate social institutions to access opportunities in the legal sphere?
So this summer, hopefully when I graduate, I will be the first hijab wearing Muslim woman to graduate from the JD program. So I'm super excited for that. And with the success came a lot of challenges because I was in a condition and a circumstance where people were unfamiliar with my morals, my beliefs, my practices. And in a lot of ways, I've experienced racist behavior even from school faculty, and that can be discouraging for someone who isn't grounded in their roots and their community and support from their people. That can be really discouraging. But one lesson that I really took from law school was to network well and just to go all out in finding who you're attracted to, what you're attracted to, and just chase it, because people are so open to sharing and learning and introducing you to the right people to get in touch with to do what you want to do. So, situations I've dealt with where I felt ostracized from the student community, and then also facing racist comments from my professors directly, deterred me from a lot of the quote unquote law school experience. But when I tapped into my community, the attorneys who I thought were representing my people and my cause, I found it so much easier, because it only takes one connection. It only takes you to click one time to find the right mentor, to find the right circle for you to move forward and figure out what you love doing. And that was really just the breaking point for me in helping me navigate these spaces.
I'm really sorry to hear that you had to experience racism in an institution that is supposed to help enlighten and awaken people to their highest potential and educate people about what's happening in and around the world. How have you had to explore your identity in this space? And how has that sort of helped you negate the kind of racist comments that you've had to hear?
So there's two parts to that question. The first being my moral stances and judgment as a Muslim, how I've had to go into law school and understand the law from that perspective. There's a lot of harm that is institutionalized and it's legitimized by the law and it's perpetuated through the legal system. And as a Muslim, there are things that I simply cannot accept. And I cannot accept hyper incarceration, or what's commonly called mass incarceration. I cannot accept the way in general that the criminal justice system works here. And so having to figure out what can I do in a way that's helpful and moral has definitely been a journey, and it's guided me to a very narrow area that I'm interested in exploring later on in practice. And then the second part of that question with respect to my identity and my social identity and interaction with those around me, I've just learned that sometimes you just have to keep your head down, do your best, and then help those coming after you. And that's kind of what has happened unintentionally. So on LinkedIn, we met through LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. It's my favorite social media platform. I've had a lot of girls reach out to me just because I wear hijab and just because I go to the law school saying, "Oh, I'm interested. Can we schedule a date to talk? Can you help me with my application? Can you help me fill this out for a scholarship?" So that's what I'm trying to do, is just pay it forward, make my imprint, and do what I love doing with the skills that I learned there.
I love that. I'm all about paying it forward. I think this is a great segue to the next question, which you've already answered in the previous questions. Why did you decide to study law, and how do you intend to use your law degree now and in the future?
The law, the way that I've studied it and understood it, now even in my third year of law school, is a tool that can be used to oppress. It is a tool that can be used to harm. And especially when those in power are centered on maintaining that power and maintaining a position of exploitation, in a lot of ways that's what just becomes the norm. So it has the ability to also establish the norms for a society or a country or what have you. I also believe that those types of systems should be challenged at every level. And as someone who's been really involved in grassroots advocacy, you can't ignore the second component of it, which is advocacy at an institutional level. And so my path and my relationship with the law has been trying to use the law as a tool to undo harms or promote justice and goodness for those around us, and especially the most vulnerable and targeted people in our societies and communities, who tend to also be the most targeted and vulnerable by the law itself.
Now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about your research, which I'm really excited about. You conducted research on the treatment of individuals in Syrian prisons. What urged you to conduct this study?
As someone who comes from a Syrian background, I have visited Syria last in the summer of 2010, which was right before the revolution. And when we went, it was a very eerie experience. After we went home, we were able to talk more about it. But everywhere you went, you would see posters that would take up entire walls of the dictator Bashar al-Assad and his family and his wife, framed photos of his father as well, Hafiz al-Assad, everywhere. And nobody would discuss politics openly. There was not a single conversation that I heard or overheard that critiqued any policies, even though a lot of people were struggling, a lot of people, just had like very little hope in their lives because of how much corruption existed in the system. And then after the revolution broke out in 2011, more people became outspoken on the atrocities that happened in broad daylight, and also the atrocities that happened literally underground in underground dungeons in Syria's prisons. And when these types of stories started coming more to light, it became a very big moral imperative for the international community to act when we know that some of the most flagrant human rights violations are being committed, and major superpowers are supporting this type of oppression and this type of regime. What do we do? So when this kind of greater climate was happening, I was traveling to Jordan regularly every summer to volunteer with Syrian refugees, and every single family I spoke to at some point brought up detainment or imprisonment and torture. And it was the main reason for a lot of people's forced disappearances. So sometimes a dad would go out to buy bread, he'd be detained, and the family would never hear from him again. And there was a huge question there: should the family wait for him, or should they leave and escape to safety before they are also threatened and harmed? So I was drawn to the area of research from a humanitarian perspective, and then from a religious perspective, understanding the sectarian dimension to the abuse of power in Syria was also really important to me. Iran is the biggest supporter for Bashar al-Assad, and it has been since the beginning of 2011. And it has a lot of quote unquote sectarian interest. They can claim that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's real. In promoting and supporting foreign militias like Hezbollah, and then also foreign Shia militias from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, to essentially engage in violence against the Syrian people and establish the dominance of the regime and the presence and power of Iran as a whole. So I really wanted to come at this research from that angle and explore how the macro abuse of power in terms of sectarian abuse of power is also translated at a micro level with the torture by Syrian government officials and people of the people in Syria.
So I just wanted to know a little bit more about what you learned as a result of this research, not only about yourself, but also about the Syrian people and the prison system in Syria.
So what I learned a lot of things. It was a really harrowing experience to interview and collect information from torture survivors, which is what I did. And my family in Jordan, they're refugees, they're Syrian refugees. And so, I was just kind of meeting people through the community, trying to see who would be willing to talk about their story, anonymously even. And that's kind of how I went about doing it. And what I found was people were telling me incredibly gruesome details. People were telling me about the verbal and physical abuse, of course, and then also the torture that is unprecedented. It's things that you can't even imagine or stomach to imagine, related to sexual abuse, restrictions on prayer and any type of spiritually uplifting activity. The most common torture techniques included something called shabah, which is when you tie somebody's hands together and you hang them backwards from a ceiling, like on a single string. Something called the dulab or tire, which is when they would fold and place somebody in a tire and just beat them mercilessly in a position where they're completely vulnerable and exposed. And that isn't even to begin going into the content warning of like sexual abuse and rape, and the horrific stories that you'd hear of people being forced to rape family members in front of other family members. And it really was just like complete psychological torment. And when you talk to people who've survived Syrian torture, a lot of them reference the same kinds of patterns and the same kinds of torture. So something really common that even we grew up hearing about was the extracting of fingernails and toenails. So they would take pliers and extract people's fingernails and toenails, and just in every type of way try to break them down. And what this research taught me was that the Syrian people were willing to risk everything for their freedom in 2011, because sometimes the point comes up: why did the Syrian people rebel? Such harm came to them that could have been mitigated if they just stayed quiet. But the reality is, if they were already enduring this, they were going through all of this. One, they knew how barbaric the regime was. They knew how much harm could come to them. Also, by example of past uprisings, they knew how vicious they could be. But two, they were willing to sacrifice everything to put an end to this torture and end to this oppression. And that just to me proves how steadfast their commitment was, how completely selfless they were and willing to risk their lives for their children and the greater cause. And it really just speaks to the resilience of the Syrian community, and it's absolutely incredible. It really is absolutely incredible.
What's the one thing that sticks out to you when you speak to Syrians back home or in USA?
The torture is definitely one of the main things that stood out to me, but other things that interested me, that were interesting, was how well aware they were of the discourse around the dehumanization of Syrian refugees. So they know exactly how Trump or other leaders were talking about Syrian refugees, dehumanizing them in different ways. And it was just a complete, it's such an offense because Syrians have always been known to be generous. They opened their actual homes to refugees when Lebanon was being attacked by Israel, and they've always done nothing but to support people who were oppressed throughout history, even if it meant giving their own room or their own clothes. So it's always been just an outstanding fact that they know exactly how the world views them, and it's just a very, sad and undeserving characterization of the Syrian people, who, even as refugees, have built reputations for themselves as people with, you know, outstanding work ethic, people with an outstanding commitment to perfection and community and generosity.
How were you able to go to Jordan and really conduct this research? Did you have an organization that supported you?
The way that I went to Jordan in previous summers, so around 2013 and beyond, was through family. So we would go back home with family, visit people there. And my uncle worked at the time at an organization called the Syrian American Medical Society. And they are one of the leading, if not the leading, medical society that serves the Syrian refugee population, both within Syria and outside of Syria. And he was the chair of the mental health board, and he was able to kind of connect me and then also my cousins who work there with people who were serving the refugee community in different ways. So some, no matter what you study, no matter what you practice, there's always a way we can give back even in humanitarian ways. So some people needed help with like resource gathering and packaging, and then in other situations, it was more mental health services. So that was kind of my first in, was through SAMS, and I worked at a mental health facility for children, and through that, I met the women who manage the center, young women who manage the center, and they introduced me to their friends, who then I did the interviews with.
That's amazing. That's incredible. So we're going to talk a little bit about the legal sphere. Do you think the legal sphere is accessible to women? If not, what do you think can be done to change it?
I think the legal sphere is definitely accessible to women. I think there are more obstacles in some ways. I think especially for women of color, there are even more obstacles. It depends on the law school that you're in, it depends on the community that you're in. But my law school, for example, it has to be, I think, 70 to 80% white. And, being in that environment, naturally, if you're a person of color, you're ostracized more. And also at networking events, if you don't necessarily vibe with the same people that the majority of these white students do, you might not connect with them the same way. They might not reach out to you for opportunities the same way. So it definitely does have an impact. I think really the best way to handle those situations is to, number one, stay strong and know that you're in here for a reason. You are in the classroom, in the position, in the opportunities that you're in for a reason, and to really just revisit why you're here is important. And the second part is to really tap in and find your community. And it's completely fine if you only have one or two friends at law school, like myself. That's completely fine. As long as you're really doing the research, and cold calling and cold emailing, all that stuff really does work. So I highly recommend that you try to network the right way, find affinity groups, find mentorship initiatives, and try to find the right people who will get you hooked on the stuff that you want to do.
You are currently working as a law clerk at the United States Attorney's Office. Is this correct?
So I finished the externship in December, but yeah, that was like an externship that I did for 2 months, 3 months.
Wow, that sounds incredible. Could you talk about what your experience was like working as a law clerk?
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience. The reason why I took it up was because I wanted to put myself out of my comfort zone as someone who all my work experience, all my life experience has been with nonprofits and advocacy organizations who in a lot of ways actually, are challenging the government. I wanted to see what the structures and systems and processes were like from the inside when I had a chance, because it's one thing to work as a student and then it's another thing to do that work as a professional. So I really wanted to figure out, just learn a little bit more about the criminal justice system, how things worked, and I definitely got that experience. It was most of the cases that I worked on were like sex crime cases, and then I also did a hate crime case. So it was really interesting to kind of see what a lot of the caseload is like, and then also how the government interacts with different agencies. And even the person I was working with, she worked with the ACLU, so we both have that advocacy background. But it's important to put yourself out of your comfort zone, and I'm so glad that I did it while I was a student and had the chance.
How were you able to access this prestigious opportunity?
So I was at a event, and something I really like doing is going up to people after they talk, and then if I'm interested in staying in touch with them, get their email, get their LinkedIn, and see where things can go from there. So for that particular opportunity, there was a panel that was held at our school by the Women's Law Caucus about the experience of women in the law. And this specific person worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I approached her and I asked her kind of what it was like, and I took her card, and then I emailed her later that day, and when we spoke in person she mentioned that there was an externship opportunity, and even though it was late I applied and I interviewed the next week and I was able to secure it. So it really was just me like throwing myself out there, just going up to the table, even if there's a lot of people, just wait and just kind of communicating my interests and seeing what I could benefit from and how they could benefit.
I think a lot of people can learn from your experience here, because oftentimes you'll find that students in general, regardless of whether they're studying law or any other subject, they tend to self-reject and not apply for positions that they are really passionate about or positions that they would like to work in. So I think your experience here is absolutely incredible, and hopefully people will be inspired to actually apply for those positions regardless of what the outcome is for them. You previously worked as a legal and advocacy intern for American Muslims for Palestine. Could you talk a little bit more about this experience?
So I worked as a legal and advocacy intern over the summer of 2020, and I thankfully and gratefully landed a position as a media coordinator, which I'm working as now. And I'm really, really happy. So American Muslims for Palestine, I found out about this organization through actually a Facebook ad one day when I was scrolling, and they were advertising their advocacy day. So Palestine Advocacy Day is held every year, and it gathers hundreds of people from around the country, and they have talks and trainings on how you lobby your members in Congress. And I was really intrigued by this advertisement, so I asked around about the organization, and I ended up signing up and then flying out to DC to attend. And it really was a life-changing experience in that I was able to connect with so many new people working on exactly what I cared about. I just had no idea these people existed, this network existed. So it was an awesome opportunity. And after that, I went back and I stayed in touch and continue to follow the great work that they do with respect to education and advocacy. And I was actually planning on doing an internship at the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America that summer, but it fell through due to COVID. So I reached out to, my friends at AMP and I asked, hey, could I please do an internship with you all? and it was incredible. I was able to help organize the same event that I mentioned, the Palestine Advocacy Day, virtually, and we had over 100 scheduled meetings with members of Congress, over 800 attendees who did the training virtually, and they were ready to lobby for human rights and against war crimes. So it really was a wonderful experience, and I was able to also just learn more about what organizations were out there, who was working on what. And now as a media coordinator, I'm continuing that work and also just trying to amplify the work that ANP is doing within the media.
What are some of the challenges that you and the organization have experienced as a result of trying to educate the community about the situation in Israel-Palestine?
So, as you may know, the United States is the biggest funder for Israel. So, they give $38 billion every 10 years to the state of Israel just to support its military endeavors, and a lot of that money is actually exchanged through weapons deals. And working in the US to promote Palestinian rights and fight against Israeli war crimes that in many situations are funded by the United States government itself is difficult because you have a grassroots movement, a grassroots organization working against an entire state. But what we've seen in a lot of other countries like South Africa, when popular movements rise, things kind of clear up. And despite the propaganda or misinformation that Israel and Israel primarily tries to spread about Muslims, about Muslim activists, about Palestinians, about Palestinian activists, the public is becoming increasingly aware about the reality in Palestine and how Palestinians are treated like second-class citizens, second-class humans in the occupied territories. They're governed by a system of apartheid. They, in many ways, are systematically being killed. I'm not sure if you've read it recently, but they're being denied the opportunity. Israel is being praised now for its COVID vaccination rates, but Palestinians aren't even on that agenda. And as an occupying state by international law, they have that responsibility. So it's definitely not an easy fight, but it is one that we will continue to carry because we believe in it. We believe that truth and justice will always prevail. And at the end of the day, the people know what is right, and we will continue to educate to work towards that.
I'm so glad to hear that. Now I want to switch gears again to talk about just some general advice that you would like to give to students. I'm sure you've already, throughout this interview so far, have given some amazing advice, but is there anything that you would like to say to individuals of marginalized or minority communities who are trying to get their foot in the door in accessing opportunities in law?
I would definitely advise you to reflect a lot, try to be as self-aware as possible. For me personally, I like to journal, I like to write, and that helps me get my ideas out there and kind of narrow them down to see what I can do to take action and move towards what I want in life. So what I really would advise you to do is, number one, be self-aware. Know what your strengths are, know what your weaknesses are, and know what your areas of growth are. And then the second part is really just to take action. So if you see an area where you think you could improve, sign up for classes or buy a book about the topic and try to educate yourself and improve yourself every day. And if there's something that really grabs you, just run after it, because the sky's the limit. We really have so many opportunities afforded to us. Being alive, every breath is a blessing. So if you see somebody who's doing cool work, hit them up. It doesn't matter if they don't respond. Like most people, if you cold email or cold call like 10 people, at least 2 will respond, at least 3. And sometimes it's all you need. And try your best to build good relationships, establish a good reputation with truthfulness, honesty, integrity, and we'll all find our place. It's just a matter of time.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Malak. This was absolutely enlightening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all that you do as well. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your time.
Well, folks, that is all for this episode of Women in Leadership. If you would like to listen to our previous episode, Paula Tesserero, Advocating for Disability Visibility, the link will be provided in the description box below. Make sure to support our work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Do not forget to follow us on our social media handles to stay up to date on all our content. See you all in the next episode.